The debate over migration in the European Union is heating up again after last month's deadly shipwreck in southern Italy. More than 80 people are known to have died after a boat carrying migrants and asylum seekers broke apart a few hundred meters from shore. Our reporter, Rosie Berchard, visited the scene of the disaster near Crotone, where the search for victims and for answers continues.
Weeks after calamity struck the coast of Calabria, strong winds bring more bodies near shore. Divers carry the remains to the coroner. A little girl is among the dead. Hasib survived. He tells us he left Afghanistan because his life was in danger, but more peril lay ahead.
I
will never forget that day in all my life. The sea conditions were even worse than they are now. I thank God that I was saved and that I am alive. I was able to save myself by grabbing and holding onto a piece of wood from the ship.
In the sand, objects outlive their owners.
The shore here is still strewn with destroyed clothing, shoes, and even parts of the boat so many hoped would carry them to a safer or a better life. Instead, dozens drowned before ever reaching Italy, and now what's left are these broken bits and pieces of lives lost.
Down the coast, we meet fisherman Vincenzo. After witnessing the wreck, he's been advising search teams on the waters he knows well. But his nets now lie empty, and his boat hasn't budged from dry land.
I cannot go back out to sea. I can't handle it. Images of those dead bodies keep coming to my mind, and I can't bring myself to cast out my fishing nets. I just can't.
Some say this tragedy was all too predictable. Local volunteer Francesca spends her evenings serving up food to undocumented migrants and people in need. She thinks the shipwreck sheds light on failed policy and a lack of legal pathways into the European Union.
The government really needs to get better at welcoming migrants. They don't view immigration as a positive thing. They say they need to cut down migration flows instead of helping people arrive.
In the cold light of day, Italy's government says its conscience is clear. Rome is forging ahead with controversial plans to restrict rescue ships operated by non-profit groups. Authorities here blame smugglers for deaths at sea and insist more EU support is needed.
This problem must at least become a European problem. Italy alone cannot bear all of this. It's true Italy lends itself more than other nations to boat arrivals, but it's clear that all these people do not want to stay in Italy. They want to move to other countries, like Germany.
Hasib has come to this makeshift morgue in the local sports hall to pay his respects. His future remains uncertain, but he says he's lucky just to have one. Calabria wants to draw a line in the sand under this catastrophe. But more migrant boats have already arrived since the wreck, and some fear that before long, these waves may once again carry death and destruction to shore.
Earlier, I spoke to DW's Rosie Berchard, who filed that report. I asked her if the tragedy near Crotone has hardened the EU's stance on migration.
Well, these tragedies often do serve to move migration and asylum policy up the agenda in the European Union. And I used the word disasters plural because despite the fact that this particular tragedy near Crotone in Italy was shocking, there was one of the deadliest in the last decade, this is not the first disaster of its kind. And Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni of Italy, from the party, the Brothers of Italy, often considered far right, let's not forget that she was elected on a promise to clamp down on these irregular boat arrivals. Now, she is pushing forward with a couple of policies. Since this particular tragedy, she is planning to tighten sentences for people smugglers, people who are essentially transporting migrants and asylum seekers on these clandestine boats. She says they are essentially trading in death and profiting from misery. And beyond that, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is also looking into policies considered very controversial to restrict the activities of search and rescue teams run by non-profit groups at sea. She says those groups are essentially encouraging people to make these perilous journeys. Now, that particular policy has been widely criticised, not least by the UN, but Prime Minister Meloni of Italy is also looking to Brussels here in Brussels and saying more European Union support and coordination is needed.
The EU commissioner responsible for migration says the problem of uncontrolled migration and tragedies like that off the coast of Crotone can only be solved by creating what she calls legal migration routes to Europe. What does she mean by that, Rosie?
Well, I think what we need to know is the nub of this issue here is the current policy for migration and asylum in Europe, under which people have to claim asylum in the first country they arrive in. And that does put a lot of pressure on external border countries like Italy, but also Greece or Cyprus. They say a more fair system needs to be put in place where different countries also take in a share of the migrants and asylum seekers which are arriving on the European Union's shores. But it's within that context, which is, I should say, a toxic political debate on which EU countries have not so far managed to agree any sort of path forward. It's against that context that the European Home Affairs Commissioner Ylva Johansson is saying that really the bigger crux of this issue is that people will not stop getting on these boats, risking lives in order to enter the European Union until there are ways to enter the European Union legally, more work permits, easier access to residence permits, and that's something she's also pushing for.
Rosie, thank you very much. That was our correspondent Rosie Birchard there in Brussels.
And for more on this, I would like to welcome Juan Fernando Lopez Aguilar. He is the chair of the European Parliament's Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs. Welcome to the program and thank you for joining us. Italian authorities say that they are facing thousands of migrants, thousands of arrivals, and that they feel completely left alone by the rest of the EU. Is that fair?
No, it is not. It's not acceptable. It is not to be accepted, neither normalized. There was, again, a debate in the plenary in Strasbourg right afterwards, and surely we will deal with the matter in the committee I chair, the Committee of Liberty, Justice and Home Affairs. We are trying to strike a balance between shared responsibility and binding mandatory solidarity among member states. But all member states are bound by EU law, which is already effective and enforced. It includes international humanitarian law as a source of EU law. So it's absolutely unacceptable that any member state fails to do its very best, its utmost, to rescue lives in seas, in dire straits, or before a shipwreck.
Are you directly pointing that criticism at the Italian authorities right now?
Well, that criticism has been outspoken in the European Parliament and endorsed by a majority. Of course, we are not to draw into conclusions, but it is a fact that Frontex has made a statement that they alerted the Italian authorities, that they warned about the ship near the coast of Crotone, and yet there was again a heavy death toll. Absolutely unacceptable. Many of them children, women and children. So something has to be done in order to come up finally with the EU framework for search and rescue, but more than that, insisting on legal pathways, safe legal pathways, humanitarian visas, with all of the tools at disposals in order to prevent that illicit trafficking of human beings to taking such a death toll, not only in the Mediterranean, but also in the Atlantic, with the boats approaching the Canary Islands in the Canary Islands route to the European Union, and of course making sure that all of member states do abide by EU law and by international humanitarian law for that matter.
So now you've been making the case for establishing legal routes, as you've been highlighting there, into the EU to deter migrants from risking their lives at sea. Tell us what you have in mind and how exactly you hope to get that passed, especially considering that we have seen European governments coming to power on an anti-migration agenda.
We know only too well that there has been a negative approach towards migration and asylum-related issues for all too long. Second, we know that they are divisive. They are geographically divisive, politically divisive, they are electorally divisive among the member states, and I have seen that in the EU Council of Ministers. But still, there is a pro-European majority in the European Parliament making the case for a balance which is finally to be struck between responsibility and solidarity. And solidarity takes to make sure that no country is left on its own. Why some countries misbehave so grossly? Because they are exploiting the anger and frustration in their national electorates regarding the lack of European response to the strategy that it takes in the holistic approach. In the external dimension, countries of transit of origin, strengthening the cooperation, dismantling the business model of the illicit trafficking of human beings, but making sure that once people are rescued, human beings are rescued, or once they make it on the doors of the European Union, they are treated respectfully, with dignity, respect to the fundamental rights, because the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights protects not only EU citizens, but also all foreigners, including migrants, when they are under EU law. And EU law is effective and enforced for all of the member states. There is EU law at stake here. Of course, we want to strike a new balance, but still there is a migration package and an asylum package which is still enforceable, and all member states should abide by it.
Juan Fernando Lopez Aguilar, we have to leave it there. Conversation, of course, to be continued. As we mentioned, you're from the European Parliament's Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing that view.